Great. All right. Everybody can hear me all right? Yes? Great. Excellent. Look, thank you all very much for your attention this evening, and thank you very much to the Peters for the invitation. My name's Aaron, and I've been a member of the ACT Scale Model Society for about 2 years, I think, but a scale modeler for eons, for as long as I can remember, since I was about 7 or 8. I'd sort of always attended Scale Act and sort of thought, oh yeah, I should probably, join. This is a really worthwhile thing. I did, and it was probably the best thing I ever did. It got me away from the dynamics of 2 small children and home and all that sort of stuff, and just coming out here and just sort of socialising with like-minded individuals. Peter Davis asked me to come along and have a chat because I really think he was scraping the bottom of the barrel for talent. But he asked me to talk firstly about scale water techniques for model ships. And I've only tried it once, and I think that was part of the pandemic build, and it was sort of a success, a bit of an online tutorial. But what I suggested as a bit of a save round was to talk about a piece of research that I had done during the pandemic, during the lockdown period. And this is the fruits of that research. As well as a scale modeler, I spent 15 years working as a historian at the Australian War Memorial. And where I found that I was applying, I guess, a scale modeler's lens to Australian military history, and then as a scale modeler, or as a historian, I'd often take that sort of passion for Australian military history into my model building. So it was a bit of a catch-22, as my bank balance and my wife can very fondly attest. But why do I model? Well, I always find it's a nice break. It's a nice mindfulness project for me to go out into the garage to apply myself to a model kit, whether it's from the First World War or anything else. I mainly build 172 scale aircraft from the First World War. And also recently Luftwaffe subjects related to the bomber offensive campaign during the Second World War. But I think when I was really thinking about why I model, I think it's the human interest element that really does it for me. There's this nice, neat little quote by everyone's favourite Prussian, von Clausewitz, who talks about the changing character of war. It always changes, but what remains a constant is its enduringly human element. What I take away from that is, for me, despite the changes in conflict over time and the technology changing as we as modelers can fully appreciate, it's really the human interest story that interests me the most, and I bring that to my scale modelling. And certainly tonight I'm going to be talking about the Albatros D.Va in the Memorials collection and the story behind it, but also I've also bought my 1/48 scale rendition of that aircraft on the little build table there. But what also I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the story of the German pilot who flew the aircraft, which until relatively recently was largely unknown. So we're going to get to that in a little bit, but it really underlines that interest of mine about warfare bringing an enduringly human element, and certainly what I bring to, or how I look at all aspects of Australia's military past. So I'm going to begin my talk this evening and situate you in place and time. Oh, if I can just move that back. There we go. Just after 2 p.m. on the 17th of December 1917, an R.E.8 reconnaissance aircraft of number 69 Australian Squadron Royal Flying Corps took off from its airfield at Bayeux on the Franco-Belgian border to carry out an artillery observation sortie over the German lines in the Messines sector. In the cockpit of that aircraft was a 32-year-old Lieutenant James Sandy, who was an experienced pilot who had served as an artilleryman on Gallipoli. And behind him was a 28-year-old observer, Sergeant Henry Hughes, who was on his first operational flight in the skies over the Western Front. Oh gosh, there we go. Now, artillery observation was one of the primary roles of the squadron since its arrival in France just 3 months earlier, and established as number 3 Squadron Australian Flying Corps in Point Cook in Victoria in September 1916. It was one of 3 Australian Flying Corps squadrons that saw operational service on the Western Front during the First World War. Arriving in France September 17, number 3 Squadron was renamed number 69 Australian Squadron Royal Flying Corps to avoid confusion with the number 3 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. Although the new title was never formally adopted by any of the troops that served in that squadron or indeed the broader Australian Imperial Force. Now, as a designated corps squadron, its primary role was reconnaissance, and it spent its first few weeks in France cutting its teeth with 2 veteran Royal Flying Corps squadrons at Savy Airfield in support of the Canadian and British corps that were operating in the Arras sector further south, supplying their headquarters with photographs, reconnaissance reports, and helping the artillery with its accuracy. And in November 17, number 69 Australian Squadron transferred to Bayeux in support of the 1st Anzac Corps in defensive positions in the Messines sector during the winter in Flanders. Now, artillery spotting was particularly useful during the role in the winter months, which was often brought by ground visibility as low cloud and fog obscured the area's characteristic low-lying terrain. The first snow had fallen just a few days earlier, but this cold Monday afternoon was clear, and Sandy and Hughes were taking advantage of the good visibility to range the 8-inch guns of the 101st Siege Battery of the Royal Garrison Artillery, which was shelling the German positions southwest of Cammin. As Sandy flew the aircraft, he would have been reading a map of the terrain and communicating adjustments on the fall of artillery to the battery commander via a Sterling Spark transmitter. And Hughes, seated behind him with a Lewis light machine gun fitted to a rotating gun mount, was scanning the skies for German aircraft. Now, half an hour into their sortie, 5 German Albatros scouts punched through the clouds between Armentières and Doulemont and dived in for the kill. And then, probably summoned to put an end to the shelling, the sleek wooden Albatros were much faster and nimbler than the cumbersome Harry Tate. Each of the German aircraft were equipped with 2 forward-firing LMG-08-15 Spandau machine guns, and pilots were trained to block the path of retreat and assail their prey from several directions. Now, this was a mismatched fight that should have been over in seconds, but pretty much all things considered, the Australians gave a good account of themselves. Sandy banking in a tight circle to give Hughes the opportunity to engage first with his Lewis gun. Now, if Hughes had missed or lost precious time clearing a stoppage, Sandy might have been able to bring the aircraft around to engage the German aircraft with the R.E.8's forward-firing Vickers machine gun. Now, within a few minutes, one of the German scouts dropped from the sky, its engine completely silent, and it made a forced landing in the Australian lines behind Plugsteert Wood. With thousands of Australian soldiers below watching, Sandy continued to throw the R.E.8 around the sky in what was described by one artillery officer as the most gallant action he had ever seen. A second Australian R.E.8 joined the fight, and then a third, and after 13 minutes, the remaining Albatros scouts broke contact and left the scene. Lieutenants Ern Jones and Keith Hodgson in the second R.E.8 flew alongside Sandy and Hughes before returning to Bayeux for ammunition and fuel, and deemed the pair uninjured and able to continue with the artillery spotting sortie. But as evening approached, apprehension grew for the crew had not returned and were no longer communicating by their radio. Nearly a full day had passed after Sandy and Hughes were last seen, whereupon 69 Australian Squadron received a telegram from a hospital at St. Paul saying that an R.E.8 had come down a few kilometres northeast of the town and 2 dead crewmen were with the aircraft. A single armour-piercing round had passed through Hughes' left lung into the back of Sandy's head. And incredibly, their perfectly trimmed R.E.8 had been carried 80 kilometres by a northeasterly wind before running out of fuel and coming down more or less intact. It had ground loop before coming to a halt in an open field, its throttle still fully open. The seemingly frozen body of Hughes was found lying on the lower wing. By all accounts, he was probably in a state of rigor mortis, but he had been mortally wounded and presumably retained some sense of consciousness to fall out of his compartment after landing before succumbing to his wounds. Now, while still missing, Sandy and Hughes were recommended for the immediate award of the Military Cross and the Distinguished Conduct Medal for their actions. But when death was established, these were withdrawn in accord with the criteria of the day, as they could not be awarded posthumously. The bodies of the 2 dead Australian airmen were recovered and they were subsequently buried at St. Paul Communal Cemetery Extension. The story of Sandy and Hughes and the final flight of their so-called ghost plane to St. Paul is a well-known episode in the experience of the Australian Flying Corps. And it was made all the more memorable by the capture of the Albatros D.Va that was forced to land within Australian lines It's one of the most iconic aircraft in the collection of the Australian War Memorial. For the British, it was the first complete example of the new Albatros D.Va variant that had entered service with the Imperial German Air Service around October 1917, and it had the potential to be a testbed for enemy technology and performance. But to the Australians, it was the significant trophy that represented the capture of their first intact enemy aircraft. A round, most likely fired by Hughes, had ruptured its fuel tank and slammed into the upper thigh of his 24-year-old pilot, Lieutenant Rudolf Klaus of Yasta 29, who upon landing was surrounded by Australian troops and captured before he had a chance to destroy the aircraft and prevent it from falling into the hands of the British. Klaus had come to ground just inside the lines of the 2nd Australian Division near the dugouts of the 21st Battalion at a position known as Burnt Out Farm. Major Alf Reed was one of the company commanders of the 21st Battalion in the line at the time and wrote the following description of Klaus's capture. He said, "Before the pilot had time to destroy the aircraft, we seized him and I placed a guard over the plane. The pilot, a young German officer wearing an Iron Cross, was brought to my dugout and I advised brigade headquarters of what had occurred. The prisoner had a flesh wound in one leg caused by shrapnel from one of the Archies, or anti-aircraft gunners. We dressed the wounded after we had searched him." That night, members of the number 69 Australian Squadron hatched a plan to retrieve the Albatros from the Ford area. At 8 p.m, the squadron's equipment officer, Captain Roderick Ross, took a team of aircraft mechanics into the Australian Ford area near Armentières, where he found Klaus still under guard from the 21st Battalion and in pain from his leg wound. Under fire from German heavy field howitzers, the team set about recovering the Albatros, which they had decided not to fly back to Bayeux. Understandably nervous by the prospect of being hit either in the air or on the ground by shells and their fragmentation, the muzzle flashes from a nearby British gun battery provided enough illumination to allow the mechanics to take the Albatros apart and load it onto the back of a flatbed truck. Once its wings were off, the team trucked the Albatros and the wounded Klaus back to Bayeux, where, according to one aircraft mechanic, there was much interest all day in a racy-looking bus, which, by all accounts, was formally identified as Albatros D.Va, serial number 539017. Now, the day after its capture, the Albatros made its first stop on its very long and convoluted route from Bayeux back to Australia. By order of the 2nd Brigade Royal Flying Corps, it went first to the headquarters supplier at Saint-Omer. The Australians put a claim in for it to be allocated to the recently established Australian War Records section, but the British had a more pressing need for it. After minor repairs and modifications that included a new propeller, it was given the serial number G101, received RFC roundels, and was flown to Britain for test flying to ascertain its flight characteristics. Now, after about 14 hours flying by several British pilots, it was reclaimed by the Australian Flying Corps, dismantled and packed for shipping back to Australia. It didn't leave for over a year, so it was reassembled and displayed at Australia House in London well after the armistice. Once it was back in Australia, Klaus's Albatros was accessioned into a collection of what went on to become the Australian War Memorial, where it's been on and off display over the intervening decades. This is probably the scene that you're most familiar with, as it was on display in Aircraft Hall, the Australian War Memorial, between 2008 and 2021. It's now been disassembled. Anzac Hall no longer exists, but the Albatros is in storage at the Memorials repository at Mitchell. The Albatros underwent 2 major restorations over the course of its lifetime. The first in 1968, when all remaining paint and fabric was removed and a spurious scheme of lozenge-painted fabric was applied. And the other, more accurate restoration was in 2008, when it was repainted in a scheme as close to the original as possible and using lozenge fabric made in the original factory in Germany. Klaus's Albatros is the more original of the 2 surviving German Albatros D.Vas left in the world, and the other being on display at the US National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. And not without a touch of irony, it too had the misfortune of being brought down by a single bullet through its fuel tank. So getting to the point of there's another, I think this is the money shot for tonight. Everybody loves cockpit photos. This is a really good reference photo, of course. Whilst I'm scrolling through these photos, I want to do a bit of a shout out to Mike Nelms. Where's Mike? Mike up the back there. His excellent book, A Unique Flight. It covers most of the detail of the technical aspects of the aircraft, and also includes these very reference shots. But so if you're interested in First World War aviation, grab Mike's book because it's got all these really cool photos in it. So, wer ist Leutnant Klaus? Who is Lieutenant Klaus, the guy who flew this aircraft? While the story of Sandy and Hughes and the capture of the Albatros is a well-documented episode in the Australian Flying Corps, the same cannot be said of its pilot, who pretty much faded into obscurity the moment he was captured. And as Mike observes in his book, both the British and the Australians were more interested in the Albatros than its pilot. Now, all the memorial knew of Klaus that he was born in the German kingdom of Saxony and was a relatively new pilot to the German squadron Jasta 29. There seemed little detail on Klaus in the available German military records, which was a problem that was exacerbated by the fact that the RAF had done such an excellent job at destroying the Prussian military archive in a single bombing raid in April 1945, which along with the archive, went about 80% of Imperial German Army's operational records from the First World War. Now, a search of Saxon military records in Dresden provided some biographical detail on Klaus, knowing that he was from Saxony, but these seem to confirm just little minor fragments that the memorial already knew. But during that pandemic, I was able to piece together a more clearer picture of Klaus and his endeavours because I managed to find what is his German equivalent of his First World War service record through the digitisation in the Bavarian State Archives of his Kriegsstammrollen, or his entry in the Kriegsstammrollen. And this is it here, that sort of bottom entry that spans both pages there. And that's all sort of detailing the totality of his military career in a form of handwriting that's known as Säuterlinschrift. So that was my pandemic project, was translating that handwriting and building that model. All right, there's Klaus there. No, it's not, actually. We don't know what Klaus looks like because we don't know we don't know if there's ever a photograph of him, but since I've given a bit of a spiel about the human nature of warfare, I like to think that perhaps maybe that could be a photograph of him. Now, the Bavarian records reveal that Rudolf Hermann Klaus was born in Glauchwitz near Lomach in Saxony in 1893, the son of a well-to-do landowner. After completing grammar school, Klaus was engaged in farm work in Landau in Bavaria, where he faced the certainty of being called up for compulsory military service in the Bavarian army. In October, Klaus enlisted as what's referred to as einjährig Freiwilliger, a one-year volunteer, and agreed to pay for his own equipment, food, and accommodation in return for a one-year period of service and his own preference of service branch and unit. This was a significant financial investment at the time, and it says much about the affluence of the Klaus family and his future potential as an officer. Now, Klaus served in a whole range of different artillery units throughout the course of his military career, first with the Field Artillery Regiment No. 12, where he was promoted to a Gefreiter in March 1914, and then an Unteroffizier, so a junior NCO, just 2 days before Imperial Germany entered the First World War. He had 4 weeks left of his compulsory military service and had the misfortune of being an active member of his artillery regiment when it was mobilised for deployment for war, supporting the 3rd Bavarian Infantry Division. And Klaus went on to fight as an artilleryman in some of the first engagements of the fighting on the Western Front, primarily against the French during the Battle of the Frontiers, the British on the Somme during the Race to the Sea, and Flanders during the First Battle of Ypres. It may have been unfortunate for Klaus to be mobilised so close to the end of his compulsory military service, but the fact is he excelled at soldiering, and he was awarded with the Iron Cross Second Class in October 1914 and was promoted to Weissenfeld-Webel, which was a senior NCO, several weeks later. Perhaps reflecting his preference to serve with the Saxon Army in accord with his enlistment conditions, Klaus then transferred to a Field Artillery Regiment No. 115 in March 1915 and was commissioned as Lieutenant de Reserve. He was an officer 2 months later. He was wounded in the foot when his battery of field guns was engaged in an artillery duel with the British at Bayeux in June 1915 and resulted in a period of recovery at the Field Lazaret in Douai. What's ironic is that he's wounded at the very place where he's ultimately captured 2 years later. It was after this that Klaus sought a reprieve from the mud and squalor of trench life and volunteered for the German Air Service, beginning his training as a pilot in Hanover in January 1916. He went on to train at the Hamburg Flütersbull Flying School at the Hansa-Brandenburg factory near Berlin before returning to France in June 1916. He spent time at several test and practice airfields and aircraft parks behind the lines in the Verdun sector before being posted to Flugflieger Abteilung 19 on the 3rd of October 1916. Flying twin-seater reconnaissance aircraft, the squadron performed photographic and reconnaissance sorties and carried out artillery observation and light bombing tasks in support of ground troops. Klaus received his pilot's badge on the 30th of October 1916 and did particularly well in his first months as a frontline pilot. By May 1917, he had amassed 4 bravery decorations. It had been invested with the Knight's Cross for the second class with swords of Albrecht, the Iron Cross first class, and the Knight's Cross second class with swords of Saxon merit. Despite a period of illness with tonsillitis and measles, Klaus remained with the squadron until June 1917, when he was ordered to Rethnal in the Ardennes. It was there that he was posted to Yasta 29, a newly raised single-seater fighter squadron equipped with Albatros and Pfalz D3s. His health deteriorated over the following weeks, and he was permitted to return to Germany on sick leave. But after recovering, he spent 3 months at Mannheim for home defence duties before returning to Yasta 29, which was then based in Belgium in November 1917. It was at this point that the first of the new Albatros D.Va scouts were beginning to reach the frontline squadrons, although it's unclear when Yasta 29 received its new aircraft. The squadron's remaining combat logs list Klaus as having scored his first and only victory against the British R.E.8 west of Blankartsee in Belgium on the 13th of November 1917, but there was no British losses for this day documented to substantiate this claim. It was not uncommon for pilots to be regularly assigned the same aircraft, so as Mike Nelms writes, it's interesting to speculate whether it was Klaus who was actually flying the machine at that time. Klaus's patrol took off from Yasta 29's new airfield at Bellinkamp on the afternoon of 17th of December 1917, and he engaged Sandy and Hughes of the Australian Flying Corps in the skies near Plugsteert Wood, crash landing his Albatros D.Va and was captured by the Australians nursing a bullet wound to his thigh. Now, when we compare his intelligence summary based on his interrogation in Alf Reed's dugout with the details in his service record, we can actually see that Klaus deliberately obscures details of his time in service to prevent sensitive information from falling into the hands of the enemy. So this is what I found in the Australian records. I guess one of my sort of shticks, in some of my research is being able to marry up some of the Australian records with what's documented into the German stuff. So, prisoner who was the Iron Cross is a young man of 24, very intelligent but not over-willing to talk. It's not unsurprising. He started a pilot's course in January 1916 and qualified in September 1916, joining the 29th Flying Squadron, with which he remained until September 1917, where he got his wing and was posted as an instructor at a single-seater fighter combat school at Valenciennes. He's deliberately avoiding the details of what's documented in his service record there. His method of capture: the prisoner and 5 others went out for a joyride. He took no maps with him, and owing to a strong wind, he drifted out off course and lost his way, as did other machines with him. And he came down in a lower altitude in order to discover his whereabouts and was attacked by a British 2-seater. A bullet went through his petrol tank and finished up in his thigh. The machine started to fall and he was forced to land. His machine was surrounded before he could destroy it. His previous machine, a November 1917 built Albatros, is entirely undamaged. Now, Klaus was deliberately vague on his training as a pilot and made no mention of the new Yasta 29 airfield at Bellinkamp, nor his claimed victory over Blankartsee. His wounds were dressed, and he left with a captured Albatros for the airfield at Bayeux without his blood-stained canvas and flying fleece flying overboots. Alf Reed kept them as a souvenir and ultimately donated them to the memorial in the 1920s. Now, transported to England, Klaus spent the rest of the war in British captivity. Frustratingly, we don't know where exactly he was interned, when he returned to Germany, or what he did when he returned to civilian life. And as I've indicated earlier, nor do we know what actually Klaus looks like. But we know that he served in the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. He was a supply officer in a training squadron for single-seater fighters at Angers in France in 1940. Now, records from the Deutsche Dienststelle at Berlin-Reckendorf tell us that Klaus died in service on the 15th of October 1941 from injuries sustained in what is believed to have been a plane crash. So in Bucharest. So he was 48 at the time of his death. And I think when I got to that point in his service record, I actually felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I kind of felt that I'd sort of traced this guy all throughout his military career. And to learn that he had died in a plane crash almost seemed a fitting end for an aviator, but at the same time, I kind of felt compelled that I needed to do something for Klaus. So that led me, again, with my human sort of interest element with my modelling, to wanting to depict his albatross. So in summary, and to conclude, he's at age 48, the time of his death, this decorated German airman whose Albatros D.Va remains an iconic part of the Australian War Memorials collection is buried at Bucharest Popatria Cemetery in Romania. I've just got a couple of things, and there is a modelling element to this, I promise. Yeah. So if anyone was interested in sort of following my footsteps, these are the kind of the lessons learned that I'll bring to the table if anyone was interested in modelling that particular aircraft, again, which is on the display over there. The best offering is definitely the Edward boxings of the D5 and the D5A. They literally have everything that you need in the box. I mean, the weekend editions don't have the photo etch in the box, but you can still build a fantastic model without the need for all the fiddly bits. But certainly the profit pack is the way to go. Either 132 or 148. Wingnut Wings 132 scale sort of stuff. I mean, obviously Wingnut Wings has a D5A offering, but they're as rare as hen's teeth. And even just the single kit boxings are fetching anywhere beyond $300. Is it worth it? I'd say no. Although I am admiring that Gotha that's over there on the table, mind you. That's something spectacular. Something that's really unique about the Yasta 29 aircraft is its distinctive green sort of squadron markings. The D5A that's at the memorial is pretty much 3/4 of the fuselage has got this sort of emerald green paint scheme. And I sort of discovered that the right paint mix between that is, to me, is part green and flat blue, split 50-50. That gives you a nice emerald green. Aviatic decals, if you haven't used them, they're just probably the most accurate lozenge pattern that's available out there. And most of them actually come out specifically for certain aircraft. So all you have to do is just cut out the template and you're good to go. Rigging, it's really just, this is First World War aviation modelling 101. Unless you're building a Fokker triplane or a Junkers J1 or something like that, I mean, you're going to have to tackle the beast that is rigging. There's a really simple way, and it involves easy line rigging thread. Yeah, and fresh super glue. I think that's another trick as well, because if you have super glue that's probably not as fresh, it doesn't sort of adhere properly, and Will is nodding approvingly, which is fantastic. The only other sort of thing that I'd add to that is you can sort of go down a veritable rabbit hole with turnbuckles and sort of little sort of brass sleeves and things like that. There is a real sort of like simple sort of poor man's way of replicating that in 48 scale. I found this really cool stuff. It's 0.4 millimeter black rigging tube or black tubing. You just cut sort of a couple of millimeters off. You slip your easy line in there. You sort of glue it in there, and you direct contact glue it to the spot where you need it. And perhaps if there's, I don't know, enough interest, I can perhaps offer the Peters a tutorial at some point on that. Yeah, good. The other sort of thing that if you're going to tackle sort of First World War aviation modelling is the plywood finish. Most of as the Albatros left the factory, I mean, they came out in a fairly clean state in terms of its plywood, distinctive plywood fuselage. It's really easy to replicate. It's just a sand-coloured sort of acrylic over the top, wait for it to dry, dragging some sort of burnt sienna oils over the top with a little bit of kitchen sponge to sort of add some grain in there. And to me, a clear yellow for that sort of distinctive varnish effect over the top. Again, perhaps run another tutorial if required. And then we have it. Okay, excellent. Thank you.